Hello and welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm watching our numbers climb as folks from our international community continue to join us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, whatever time it is where you are. We are happy that you are here. Feel free to drop a note into the chat saying hello to your fellow PON community members. My name is Sheila Heen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Harvard Negotiation Project. I am also a faculty member at Harvard Law School responsible for the negotiation teaching program. I am also lucky enough to be involved with the Fisher Fellows and the Fisher Speaker Series. So welcome to the next installment of the Fisher Speaker Series. The Fisher Speaker Series is named after, in honor of Roger Fisher, who was one of the founders of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, as well as the Harvard Negotiation Project. The Fisher Fellows join us for a year at a time, and the Fisher Speaker Series was actually initiated by our first Fisher Fellow, the wonderful Dr. Baba Jallow. We miss him very much as he returned to the Gambia. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by someone who can speak to transitional justice in a very meaningful way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have about a half hour of presentation and then plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. I will be introducing our moderator who will run that discussion and Q&A and further introduce our wonderful speaker, Mark Freeman. Before I do that, I do want to thank the PON staff who work incredibly hard to put on this program for PON Live. So that includes Nicole Bryant, the managing director of PON. It also includes Diane Long, Lindsay Sullivan, and Laura San Pietro. Now I'm going to introduce our moderator, my friend and colleague, Lisa was a counsel at a pro bono law firm where she advised on prevention, transitional justice, and post-conflict democratic transitions. Advising delegations in Sudan, Yemen, Tanzania, and Syria. She is now a faculty member and clinical instructor at the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Research Program, or clinical program, excuse me. And without further ado, and with backup singers, as you can hear, I am going to turn things over to Lisa.
Thank you, Sheila. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here today and to be able to moderate this session where we'll learn a lot from Mark Freeman, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then also be able to engage with my questions that come up during his presentation, and most importantly, your questions too. So as Mark is giving his presentation, feel free to go ahead and pop into the Q&A with any thoughts that are on your mind, any questions that are coming up for you, so that I can make sure to get to them in the back half of our session. And so the star of the show today, I'm excited to introduce Mark Freeman to you. He is the founder and director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, which is a non-governmental organization that recently celebrated its 10th anniversary as a global peace-building innovator. So congratulations, Mark and team. Mark is a leading expert in political transitions and high-level peace negotiations and has more than 3 decades of experience. He is regularly consulted in crisis management and in conflict resolution advising as well. He has worked in countries including Ukraine, Venezuela, Colombia, Afghanistan, Bolivia, Bosnia, Burundi, the DRC, the Gambia, El Salvador, Kenya, Mauritania, Morocco, Nepal, Serbia, Sri Lanka, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, and Zimbabwe. And I'm sure there's a few others on the list as well. Mark has written a number of books that if you haven't read them already, I would encourage you to check them out after this talk to learn more about his perspective and experience, including Necessary Evils, Amnesties in the Search for Justice, and Truth Commissions in Procedural Fairness. And one of his more recent publications in 2020, he was the co-author of Negotiating Transitional Justice, which draws on his experience as an advisor inside the Colombia peace talks in Havana. He's a Canadian and a Belgian citizen and is currently in Paris as a 2024 Paris Institute for Advanced Study Fellow. Without further ado, Mark, we're really excited to learn from you and the theory of fast-track negotiations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Sheila, and thank you to the program on negotiation for this wonderful invitation. And I'll try and do some small honor to the extraordinary legacy of Roger Fisher. And what I'd like to do in particular is begin there with his most famous book, Getting to Yes, which I'm sure is known to everyone who's joined us this evening or this afternoon. It was a book that had an extraordinary and continues to have an extraordinary impact on how we think about negotiation. And in particular, for those who may be a little bit less familiar, it put forward the idea of essentially of really a new paradigm, a different way of thinking about negotiation in lieu of what was, let's say, a dominant approach to negotiation, which was position-based negotiation. The book Getting to Yes articulates a different paradigm, essentially interest-based negotiation. And what I'd like to do this evening, and I'm saying this evening, I know that you're not all there, but I'm in Paris, so it's in my mind. But what I'd like to do this evening is in the spirit of Getting to Yes, to offer up a new paradigm, but with on a different dimension, which has to do with speed. And we have a paradigm, in short, today that operates slowly, is conceived to operate slowly. And I want to offer up a different paradigm, an alternative paradigm, which has speed as a core objective for reasons that I'll set out. So again, it'll be about this idea of fast track negotiation. Now, the story behind this begins several decades ago, in fact, when in my work, I mean, as Lisa mentioned, most of my work has been focused on conflict situations and also trying to find transitions to democracy and out of authoritarian rule. And so transitions have been a big part of my work, as have negotiations. And I would say that beginning in particular in the 1990s, there was a sort of new approach that came into view specifically in relation to negotiation. It was only coming into view in the 90s. I think today it's very evident what it looks like. But the view was a kind of reaction to the way that negotiations out of conflict, negotiations out of authoritarian rule used to be practiced over centuries, over millennia, which was that they were elite-led affairs, generally organized behind closed doors, not necessarily having a lot of methodology. And in the 1990s, in part inspired by a limited number of quite celebrated examples of successful transformative negotiation, the view emerged that essentially there needed to be a model of negotiation, an approach to negotiation that had a more transformational set of objectives, that the process of negotiation should open up and slow down, in short. And as I said, it was a kind of reaction to a way of negotiation that existed for a very long period of history. And it makes sense. I mean, if you think about cases, I mean, some of the very celebrated examples would be the negotiations that led to transitions in places like South Africa, Northern Ireland, and a whole range of other places. And it makes sense that if there's going to be a negotiation, that there should be some kind of transformational hope, some transformational ambitions. The challenge in practice, and this brings me more to the present and to the story that is very specific to this paradigm, the fast track paradigm that I'm going to present. What happened is that over these years, the conflict landscape changed dramatically. The nature of warfare, the nature of political and armed conflicts changed very dramatically. There's a much greater sense of fragmentation of actors, a much greater sense of urgency to deliver results. there is a greater speed of deterioration. When there's an onset of violence or repression, the speed of deterioration has accelerated. And the issue, and I think it's come to a head at this point as a practitioner, I say this as someone who has been feeling a sense of failure in the work that I and my colleagues do. We're not delivering very many settlements. We're actually not getting to yes very often in the way that Roger Fisher would have wished. Instead, we're not reaching agreements, and I think, in short, that one very big part of the problem that that explains the situation we find ourselves in is a mismatch between that increased complexity and urgency of the conflicts that are out there and the slow model, the very idealistic and understandable model that we've built over this period of the last few decades. There's a mismatch there. So what I'm going to do very briefly is sketch out what are the sort of core principles and practices that underline and that inform the model that we have. But I'm going to focus most of my time in trying to give you a picture of a prototype for what fast track negotiation would look like, something that is a better match, that can deliver more results, again, can get us to yes more often and more quickly. So, the model that we have, as I said, is based on a kind of vision of transformation that through the negotiation process, the relationship between adversaries is transformed from a logic of confrontation into a logic of cooperation. It involves confidence building measures. Today, in particular, it involves very ambitious and, again, commendable ideals around who participates, opening up participation, the idea of inclusivity and who's involved in the process. When it comes to the settlement that is the aim of the process, the idea is that it should be more comprehensive, that there should be a lot of details in the final agreement, and so on and so forth. There's a set of principles and practices that are logical when the aim is a transformative negotiation process. There's also assumptions that are connected to this, and these assumptions I think are important to note because they also contribute to the transformational logic, but also the slow operation of this vision, of this paradigm. And here I'll mention just a couple, but in my work, I mean, you'll often hear ideas about what is called ripeness, that you should only negotiate as a matter of strategy. You should only negotiate when you have a set of conditions that are ripe for negotiation, ripe for settlement, leading you, in other words, to not to take a chance, but rather to assess and study and very often wait. Another assumption is that by virtue of establishing a negotiation, that the mere existence of a negotiation will have a kind of moderating effect or a calming effect on the adversary's relationship, but also on the conflict outside. Again, the sensation behind this, the assumption in both cases, is something that would imply that time is on your side when you negotiate. And that, again, all of this within a very transformational logic. So that's what we have. As I mentioned, the problem that we've been experiencing because of the way that conflict exists and operates today, the fragmented nature of it, the urgency of so many situations, the challenge is to take this transformational logic of the model that we have, of the paradigm we have, and apply it. And as I said, we're not getting to yes very often. In short, rarely are we getting agreements and settlements. So fast track negotiation is what I'm offering up, is what I think is right for the moment. It's the paradigm we need now. And I'm going to present it and talk a little bit about the relationship between working quickly through a fast track paradigm versus working slowly through the paradigm that we have, ways that those can be combined. So what is fast track negotiation? Well, currently in Paris, I'm trying to complete what will be a prototype for how this will look. We have examples of negotiations that have been quick, that have been fast, but there isn't a model, there isn't a paradigm there that exists for operating according to a fast track logic. So examples of the principles and practices that would inform a fast track logic. So whereas the model that we have with its transformational vision, whereas that model is premised on ideas such as broadening the participation, again, very commendable. In a fast track logic, it's not so much about broadening as much as possible, but rather having a kind of inclusive enough to get to yes, because inclusivity is a noble and strategic ideal, but within the context of a negotiation, whereas as Fisher's own book articulates, your goal is to get to yes. It is to use negotiation to get to agreements. So thinking about inclusivity with that kind of logic. What I think also is necessary when it comes to the principles and practices is to think less about the comprehensive agenda and the highly detailed final agreement, and instead to try and tighten up what goes onto an agenda. That would be logical if you're trying to move more quickly. Similarly, in terms of the length of a settlement, the level of detail in it, to be more minimalistic and leave more to the implementation phase. Again, in the logic of trying to reach settlements to get to yes, the logic of fast track is that time is not on your side. Time is running against you. And again, partly, as I say, is a reflection of the conflict landscape that we face. There's a whole set of other principles and practices that I think are also going to be critical for the fast track paradigm. I'll give you a couple of other examples. One is the tendency, again, as an ideal form of negotiation, when you're talking about negotiations to prevent or resolve situations of violence, is to think about everything needing to be in person. After all, if you have a transformational logic, it's hard to imagine that it could be done if you're doing a lot of that in a format that does not involve exclusively or principally operating in person. But a fast track logic would embrace much more actively the use of technology and data tools, a kind of modernization, intentional modernization of the way that the actual negotiation space works. Or a different example, it would be anathema within the logic that we have of the paradigm we have today to begin with what is called a zero draft, essentially an early outline of what a negotiated settlement might look like. But in a fast track logic, there ought to be logically greater comfort with that idea, the idea of zero drafts, of early outlines, maybe even before the parties necessarily have met, if there's depending again on the format. So I'm giving those just as some examples of what would be in the box of principles and practices that would inform fast track. What about the assumptions that underlie the fast track model? Because again, just as in the case of the paradigm that we have of how to negotiate, there's a set of assumptions that underlie it. Likewise, there ought to be a set of assumptions that should be articulated, should be clear when it comes to a fast track model. I think it's important to articulate, to state what those are. And so I'll mention a few of them now. So one of them, and here I'll contrast again with the paradigm that we have. I mentioned a moment ago that there's this idea of ripeness. It's very prevalent in the way that negotiation is conceived and practiced when it comes to political and peace negotiations. And so the question is, what would be maybe a more realistic assumption, one that militates in favor of speed and thus of settlement when it comes to negotiation under a fast track logic? And so here, the idea would be, instead of, again, thinking about how to move, how essentially the idea of rightness, the idea would be that you should test the willingness of the other side. Take a first step. You won't know if the situation is right without testing it. And that can be done by the principals of the negotiation or by other actors that are part of a negotiating team or secondaries at some level. But the logic of, in a fast track logic, the idea is to test early and to test often what the appetite and scope might be for negotiation. That would be an assumption. Similarly, I mentioned that with the paradigm we have, when it comes to the question of what might be the effect of the negotiation on the parties themselves? What might be the effect of negotiation on society outside? As I said earlier, there's a kind of assumption that is embedded, I believe, in the paradigm we have, which is that when the negotiation is set up, it will achieve a kind of moderating effect on the parties, and a kind of calming effect on the conflict outside of the walls of the negotiation. But in a fast track logic, a very different assumption would apply, one that I would argue is much more realistic, which is that actually when you have a negotiation, that it could more likely have an aggravating effect. There's more at stake. The spoilers come out. And it essentially could be a very polarizing event. The mere knowledge that there's a negotiation in place, more often than not, can be aggravating or even destabilizing. And so again, that's an assumption that ought to make you move more quickly. So again, when it comes to fast track, the critical part I suppose I'd want to emphasize is that the prototype that I'm developing right now is premised on the importance of methodology. We have, as I said, examples of negotiations that have been quick, but we don't have a model. And because of that, we're in this situation in my area of work around political and peace negotiations where we are not getting to yes. Now, just sort of moving to the conclusion, and here I will borrow another page from Roger Fisher and from the Getting to Yes book. There's an intriguing chapter title that is included for those of you who know the book, which is, the chapter title is Yes, But. So that's very nice that you have this idea, you're going to develop this prototype, but what about, essentially it's the concerns that might exist, the doubts people might have about a fast track model. And so there's just a few that I'll mention briefly because over the last year I've had a lot of conversations with top negotiators around the world and gathered a lot of questions, a lot of very, very useful feedback in helping to refine this model. And there's a certain set of yes buts. So I'll just mention them because they might also be in your mind. So one is the idea that there's already a fast track model. I feel that it is an understandable impression people might have. Some people are astonished that it may not exist. They say, well, surely we have a fast track model. There are lots of examples of negotiations that have been quick. But as I said, that is, I think, where things stand. We only have examples of negotiations that have been quick. We don't have a model in the sense of an articulated, organized set of principles, practices, and assumptions, very much in the way that were articulated in its time for a different paradigm in the book, Getting to Yes. A very different kind of objection is to say, well, the fast track model is interesting, but you've set it up as a kind of, you set up the alternative option, the paradigm that we have, the slow model, the transformation oriented model. You've set it up as essentially it's a straw man. There is no such thing as that paradigm. Again, here, based on all of the research we've done, looking at guidelines, practices, literature, principles that exist that have been set out by multilateral bodies and so forth and so on, including university courses, at least as far as it concerns negotiations to end or prevent situations of violence, there is a paradigm, and it's reflected in the common patterns across all the documents that have come out in our research. It also, in my case, comes out all the time just in practice. Another objection is, well, hold on, this is a dangerous idea. It could move us backwards. I mean, don't we want to see transformational outcomes? And if we're doing it fast track, that could have sort of, doesn't that going to lend itself to dirty deals and quick deals, and that they're not going to be sustainable? I would say that it ought not to. I think let's put it like this. It's more likely to do so in the absence of a model, because all we have today is a lot of ad hoc efforts at moving more quickly, because again, people need to try to move quickly. It's just in the context where we have a default paradigm that is slow, there's harsh judgment. So again, to the objection, well, that sounds dangerous. It's going to move us backwards. I suppose I would ask the question slightly. I would ask a question back, let's say, which is it better to have very few deals at all? Is it better to rarely get to yes? Because that is the situation that we find ourselves in. And so, in other words, the idea that we need, which is a sort of underlying logic of the paradigm that we have today, which is we need to open up and slow down the process. We need to make a more beautiful negotiation process in order to have a more sustainable outcome. The problem with that in practice, as I mentioned at the outset, is that we're not getting to yes. We're not actually getting to a settlement which can then be sustained. We simply are in only a rare number of cases are we getting to yes, and in the vast majority of cases we are not getting there. So that will be my response to the danger comment. And then finally, the question around let's say another objection, another yes but is, well, there are all kinds of exogenous factors, external factors to negotiation. Aren't those a bigger determinant of whether you succeed or whether you fail? I would agree with that concern, and indeed it's precisely why I argue that there needs to be a model. We need to position ourselves as practitioners to fail less, and we are failing a lot right now. And so if we can fail less because we have a fast track paradigm, in addition to the paradigm that we have, that will help us to fail less. And I guess just bringing it to a close, so that we have an opportunity for comments, questions, and so forth, and obviously also to give Lisa an opportunity to react to some of what I've shared. I did also promise that I would say something about how the fast track model would be applied, and also whether and how it might be combined with the paradigm that we have, the slower paradigm. So I want to just present three simple ways that the fast track model in the prototype I'm developing can be applied. So one is that you could have a process, a fast track negotiation that produces a single settlement. It's one process and one settlement. And so if you want an analogy here, it would be the kind of framework agreements that have been reached in a number of settings, including, just to mention a few examples, we have there's places like there was the PON agreement in Afghanistan, a very quick, very short process that established a framework for a transition. In the case of Kenya, some of you may know that is just another example of a framework deal where within a very short time, moving quickly to quell post-election violence in 2007 and 2008, essentially a framework deal was reached. It had a certain amount of details, but it was a fast process. And so there are examples of achieving quite important deals, but within a reasonably short time. So fast track could produce something like that, a framework deal, where the logic is that the details will be worked out in implementation, but you've managed to stop the bleeding, so to speak, and to begin a new process. A second way of applying the fast track, however, could be in a multiplied format. So there could be multiple fast track negotiations leading to multiple settlements. And in a very strategic way, there should be the opportunity in many cases to be able to envisage that kind of piecemeal approach. So even as you might be entering into a first negotiation with a fast track logic, with the tools that will be provided in the prototype, that you could nevertheless you could envisage that there'll be a series of agreements because you want to get started. So the idea there, as I said, is a kind of piecemeal application that could bring you over time to shrinking the conflict, reshaping the conflict, and ultimately preventing or resolving it, depending on the specific case. So that's a second way to think about it. Multiple fast-track negotiations leading to multiple settlements. And then the final way to think about this is that there may be hybrid ways to combine elements of the paradigm that we have and elements of the new paradigm, the fast-track paradigm, and that you could adjust those to specific settings and specific situations. So in short, I'll bring this to a close. As I said, I'll be publishing in the coming weeks the paper, the prototype, and the arguments. This is just to give you a preliminary view of what will be covered. But I guess I would just end by saying that in the spirit of getting to yes, this whole idea of fast-track negotiation is about getting to yes more quickly. But in the case of the work that I do, it's about getting to yes at all. That is really the level of the goal that we need to have today. Because, as I said, regrettably, we are rarely getting to yes. And I think it's something that we just have, it's a situation we have to face. And I think it's time for a new paradigm. And I believe that the fast track model will offer the opportunity to do much better and to get to yes more often and more quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm really excited to jump in with a few questions of my own, and for those who are on the webinar as well, please pop your questions into the Q&A function, and I'll be able to collate some of those too to pose to our presenter. So one of the questions that comes to my mind on the front end, Mark, is what does this look like from the start of a peace process? A conflict emerges in a country, and you want to start a fast track process as opposed to a more typical model of peace process. What would be some of the first steps in initiating a fast track process?
No, thanks a lot, Lisa. You know, it's a truism, but it has to be said that situations are going to be case specific in terms of what are the variables at play. What is your bargaining power? What are your objectives in the process? And that's only your side, then there's the other side, and so forth. So there's a lot of tailoring and customization. I think that's inevitable. And in that sense, a fast track paradigm, what will initially be a prototype for fast track negotiation, it can be thought of like a set of tools. But as I said earlier, I think to do this well, it's important to have these organized with a set of stated assumptions, a set of risks. What are the risks with moving more quickly versus more slowly? So all of that should be part of it's almost like the, imagine it like this. It's like going to a restaurant, and the way it is right now, you have one very nice organized page, which gives you a picture of, okay, well, I'm thinking about negotiation. I'd like to do it. And you've got this very nicely organized page, and it's clear, and so forth. And it may have examples and metrics for how you're going to know if you're doing, what are the risks. And then you have another page that is just a whole bunch of words all over the page, which is the situation we're in. We don't have an organized model. So to me, when it comes to a person in the situation that you've described, at a certain level, it's just to give them a better chance to get to yes, because it's an expanded toolbox. It's an expanded menu, but an organized menu. And so we have to start there. And I guess the other part just to say is that I believe when the prototype is presented, it's going to need to be tested. Again, it'll be informed by lots of examples of negotiations that have been quick. By the way, those don't only come from the fields of political and peace negotiation processes and armed conflicts and so forth. They also come from the way that a lot of commercial negotiations can be very quick. Humanitarian deals, ceasefire deals. There's a set of examples that we can show, but we have to start, I believe, with something organized on the other page of that menu.
Excellent, thank you. You spoke a lot about rightness theory, and I'm curious. One of the, of course, foundational principles of Zartman's rightness theory is that parties to a violent conflict will not negotiate sincerely in the absence of a mutually hurting stalemate, meaning that their best alternative to the negotiated agreement, their BATNA, is superior to any agreement that they think they could reach at the negotiating table. And I think something that's interesting in that framing is that there's a metric of sincerity in negotiation. So they may start negotiating, but they're not actually going to meaningfully do so in a manner in which they would want to not only get to yes, but implement that yes. And so I'm curious, with fast track negotiations and your model of being able to test the scope and appetite for negotiations earlier in the process, instead of looking for those factors of mutually hurting stalemate, how do you ensure that the commitment to negotiation is not just in word alone, but in actually getting to yes and then meaning it such that they do something afterwards? How do you test that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I'll say a couple of things in response. In a fast track logic, there's less attention to the sincerity of the other side. What is your goal in a fast track logic? What is the goal that's even articulated, going back to Roger Fisher and getting to yes? It is to reach an agreement. That is your number one goal. You may have other goals, which is successful implementation. Usually you don't want to waste your time and reach an agreement that will never be implemented. But your first goal is actually to reach an agreement. And in that sense, as I said, sincerity would be a nice variable to have in your favor. But if you don't have it, or you're not sure if you have it, but there's enough other factors that can give you confidence that you can A, get to yes, and B, maybe prevent or resolve or just improve the situation a little bit. I mean, there's this logic, as I mentioned, this phrase, which is not mine, but of shrinking the conflict. If you can move a step forward through an agreement, even if it's with an insincere side, maybe because you have enough guarantees that you've built in, where you don't have to trust the sincerity of the other side, but you've built in guarantees, you've managed to get to yes on a few guarantees. There's things you can do. And so again, in a fast track logic, you don't think as much about how sincere is the other side. It's really focused on getting to yes, getting to an agreement that it may only be a starting point. In other cases, it may be much more than that. That's why I gave the example of framework deals that can actually just completely stop the bleeding. In other words, you're removing the violence. You have a million other challenges that you face, but you've solved a very big one. So again, sincerity is not a critical element in the fast track logic. It's nice if you have it.
Excellent, thank you. And then I'm curious to dive in to another question from my end, and then I'll be moving to some of the ones that I'm pulling from the Q&A at this time. But one that's coming in on my end is around the inclusivity element. I heard the framing of inclusive enough process. I know even in the current slower model of peace negotiations, or the more typical model, even when it does move sometimes slightly quickly, that of course there is a typical lean to having primarily political elite and armed actors in the bulk of negotiations, with some consultation with civil society, women's groups, youth groups, religious and ethnic minorities. And yet it is those latter groups that often bear the brunt of conflict and are often left out of the benefits of implementation afterwards, with priority being given to political elite and those that were signing the negotiated agreement on armed sides. And I know that some of the rhetoric that often comes up with having a more exclusive process that focuses on armed actors and political elite is to speed up the process, the time of it. And so I'm wondering what that balance looks like of inclusive enough, in which voices that you're more comfortable having more limited representation in the peace process and perhaps at other stages of the process.
Great. Yeah, no, it's a very important question, Lisa, and I think you partly answered it in the latter part of the formulation of the question, because there are multiple entry points to achieve inclusivity before a negotiation takes place, during a negotiation, and after a negotiation, or outside of the negotiation. And it's something that I've written about with a colleague, which is the balance, let's say, between the efficiency of the process and the inclusivity of the process. I suppose that the argument in short, let's say a short answer to your question, from the logic of fast track negotiation, is that the better places, or the preferable places to ensure inclusivity, are heavily in the prior end, if there is a prior phase, and also in all the different spheres of implementation, monitoring, guarantees, and everything else that may be involved with implementation. But if you want to move quickly in the negotiation, again, that's the point. You're trying to get to yes. And so if you have all of these unfavorable variables, which is the experience that we, in our work at least, are having overwhelmingly, and from the work that we've done in the interviews we've conducted over this past year, there's a feeling of persistent failure in getting to yes. And so, at least to the degree that speed is one of the big factors that's impeding us from getting to yes, and to the degree that having too many people participate in the negotiation, not around it, or before it or after it, but actually in the process, inside of that process, that's a variable that doesn't work in favor of speed, all else being equal. And so it's really a question of balance. But I really want to be clear that inclusivity is a critical idea. It's a critical goal. But in the context of the negotiation, your primary goal is to get to yes.
Thank you. Now moving to a few kind of clusters of questions and themes that are coming up in the Q&A from the audience. One that's coming up is the challenge around, if a process is sped up, how do you control for spoilers coming into the negotiation? How do you control for, if a process is sped up, it not just favoring the interest of perhaps a very strong international power that has interests in the negotiations, that pushes for agreement on certain issues that are important to them early on? And how do you ensure that the parties are not just giving lip service at the moment? I think that piece relates to the spoiler question of, are they negotiating to bide their time so that they can acquire additional territorial ground to be able to leverage more power at the negotiation? So essentially, how do you control for these kind of spoiler aspects and also undue influence by third parties in a fast track negotiation?
Yeah, so those are all great questions. I think the short answer is that all of those problems exist for either paradigm, whether the paradigm we have now or the fast track paradigm that I'm proposing. So I think they're not specific to the fast track paradigm, but I do believe very strongly that they have to, those are important concerns. You have to manage for those, you have to mitigate for those. And again, in the context of a prototype of fast track negotiation, it's for that reason that the principles, the practices, and the assumptions that underlie it are going to form part of it. So to take those one by one, I'm controlling for spoilers. So I'd mentioned that in the logic of fast track negotiation, you have, I believe, what I've proposed is a more, what I believe is a more realistic assumption about spoilers. Because I do think there is a tendency, a habit of mind, a habit of practice that we announce a negotiation and that somehow it will kind of calm or moderate things. Oh, we're negotiating now, there's a dialogue underway. And so the spoilers will kind of, they'll give it, but I believe the opposite assumption. So I mean, the answer to that first part of the question is that the fast track model will take spoilers more seriously in terms of its assumptions, not less seriously, because a negotiation is going to bring them out, not calm them down, is the idea. There'll be more of them and they'll be more active. Similarly, when it comes to potentially, let's say, strong arming by an international power or just a stronger actor, these are questions of leverage, of balance of power, and so forth. These are common to any approach to negotiation. They can't be eliminated. I think all you can offer through a prototype or a paradigm is a way to anticipate those, assess those, manage those, mitigate those. And when it comes to fast track, I wouldn't say that there's any reason why that should be seen as a greater risk. At least wouldn't be obvious to me why that would be a greater risk or even a lower risk, rather just an equivalent risk that you have to manage for. And I suppose in terms of the question, I mean, maybe a different way to think about that, and also the third part, which is the idea of lip service and so forth. I think that there's a kind of unfulfilled promise that we've now experienced over and over with the paradigm we have. And it goes really to the heart of why a fast track, I believe, is critical at the stage that we're at in terms of the conflict landscape and just in terms of experience with a paradigm over 30 years that has not allowed us to get to yes very often. And it's the following, which is, in a certain way, the idea again is that the promise, let's say, of the paradigm we have is that the more the negotiation is legitimate in terms of how it is organized, its breadth, its inclusivity, its comprehensiveness, its fairness, etc., transparency, all of these things, the more legitimate it is, the more sustainable and successful the transition will be. The issue, as I said, is that we are not getting to a settlement that can then be sustained. We have legitimate negotiation that is not producing agreements, or at least very, very rarely, meaning that the promise, the underlying promise, is vacant or hollow in some senses as a matter of practice, as a matter of evidence at this point. And so the idea of fast track is to get us to agreements more often. And in that sense, I think the challenge where we want to spend more of our energies, in short, is around the challenges of implementation. We should negotiate more quickly so that we can get to settlements, and then there'll be all kinds of challenges of implementation. And those include sustainability. That will be a challenge. But sustainability is a goal where there's nothing to sustain because you are not reaching settlement. As I say, it becomes a moot point. It becomes a moot point. The legitimacy, these are all things that have to be balanced out. And I hope and believe the fast track offers an opportunity to achieve that balance, because all those issues that you mentioned, whether it's spoilers or strong arming, lip service, these are big challenges, and the fast track has to take those seriously, just as the paradigm we have needs to.
Thank you. We've got another series of questions that have come in that are around the substance of these agreements. For instance, there's a theme that's coming up, engaging. Are there certain areas that are more easily dealt with in a fast track negotiation? For instance, the protection of civilians or humanitarian access that are more on the immediate side. And are there some issues that you believe are too complicated to be addressed in a fast track process? Also, there's a theme that's rising in the Q&A around the devil being in the details of some of the agreements. Of parties may be able to agree in principle on power sharing, a demilitarized zone, etc. But where it really falls apart afterwards is in what specifically that demilitarized zone looks like, or what specifically power sharing looks like. And so how do you think about the substance of fast track agreements?
Yeah. So no, those are great questions. I'll do them maybe in reverse. So this point around the devil's in the details is well taken. It's a critical challenge. Again, just to be clear around this, a fast track agreement tilts in the direction of less detail in the actual agreement, logically so. But therefore, that introduces a risk. But what about, well, how is it going to be interpreted? What does this mean? And so forth. So you'll have those risks, but at least you have a settlement. At least you have an agreement. This is, as I say, the parties at the front end who are thinking about negotiation, maybe thinking that negotiation is something, as a tool that should be used. Their ability to look at a well-organized 2-page menu gives them a better chance of making wise choices. And that will have to include questions like the devil's in the details. These are trade-offs to some extent. But between not having a settlement, but being confident that the devils are in the details, versus having a settlement with fewer details that then needs to be interpreted, that then can again be strengthened or reinforced by a set of outer guarantees, by expanding the participation of actors that are involved, actors that have maybe more credibility, that are given specific roles, and all kinds of other things can be done to ensure, including just basic democratic checks if you're in a democratic environment, or international checks if you need anchoring institutions and other things. So there's a lot of ways to manage for that. But as I say, between the choice of not having a settlement and having a settlement with fewer details, that is the real choice in the vast majority of cases. I would argue, based on, I think, accumulated experience at this stage over these last 30 years. Are some issues too complicated? These are things that, the work, it was mentioned, I think, by Sheila at the front end. A lot of the advising that I've done has been around how to deal with blood crimes of the past, legacies of abuse, crimes that may still be going on, and issues of transitional justice. That's a very sensitive issue for many. It's an existential issue. And so it's commonly the case that is an issue. The idea that you can negotiate some form of legal accountability as part of a larger deal, because that represents an existential threat, undoubtedly, for some of the leaders involved on one or maybe on multiple sides of a negotiation. That may be an example of something that, as a general rule, you would expect to have more difficulty in integrating into a fast track process. But if you combine that thought with the prior thought, which is around framework deals, being short on detail when it comes to the actual agreement, and putting the weight of your investment, your resources, your energies into implementation and everything that you need around that, as I mentioned, in particular, guarantees, there's not any reason why you couldn't put in a kind of holding clause into a settlement that says, and there will be which has been done in some cases. A recent example of this is in Ethiopia, where There was a very fast process that was agreed. It brought a formal end to the conflict within the country. That was reached in 2022. And it has a clause that says, and there will be some kind of process of accountability and reconciliation. I don't have the wording in front of me, but something along those lines. So you put a hold on the issue. You haven't excluded it, but that's one way, for example, to deal with it. So that's a response on that point. And then areas that are more easily dealt with in a fast track logic. Again, it'll be very case specific, but it may be, again, if your goal, which is, I think, ought to be always the first, not the only, but the first goal of using negotiation is to get to yes, is to reach agreements. Then from that logic, you have to do that calculation to say, well, what are issues that we can get to yes on? And it may be like a traffic light system where there's some red lines, no-go zones. There's going to be some clear greens. We think we can, there are conditions to reach a deal on something else. And then there's going to be yellow areas where you have to figure it out. And you're going to figure it out by testing it and make your evaluations on the go.
Thank you. And I've got one last question that'll hopefully be a short one that pulls from a few themes, and then we'll be turning it back over to Sheila to close this out. And that's in your perspective, does reaching more agreements, getting to yes more times, correlate to more peace or more sustainable peace?
Well, the short answer is, again, fair question, excellent question. I think we have to test the possibilities of fast track negotiation. I can't answer the question by looking backwards because we have that menu that I described. Nicely organized page on one side and just a scramble of words on the other. We have to test this. And I think that there's a lot of, if it's well done, if it's well tested, then I think we have the possibility. I believe very strongly that this is going to allow us to get to yes more often, and to, at the very least, and maybe I'll end with the distinction that will be familiar probably to many in the audience, which is the distinction between negative peace and positive peace. So maybe for those who don't know it, there's an idea, because it depends what you mean by peace, but there's an idea that there's sort of two kinds of peace. Negative peace is the idea of the absence of violence without more, the absence of some significant scale of violence. The idea of positive peace is the absence of inequality, the absence of violence, the absence of repression, the absence of all bad things that you can think of. And that's a distinction that was formulated not by me, but by a peace scholar many years ago. It's often referred to in the literature as well, negative peace and positive peace. But in the conflict landscape of today, the real choice is not between negative peace and positive peace. The real choice in the vast majority of situations today is between negative peace, the absence of violence, and no peace whatsoever. And if that's the choice that you have, then shrinking the conflict, reshaping the conflict even a little bit, stemming the flow of violence even a little bit, that may not be peace in the positive peace sense. But if you can get to negative peace because you're in a situation of no peace at all, that's a significant thing. And I don't think it should ever, I think that would be a very significant outcome. And it's the minimum outcome that we should expect of fast track negotiation, something that regrettably we're not getting because we are not getting to yes in the model that we have.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciated our time together, and to be able to both have the session live and have it recorded afterwards for folks that are joining us at some later date too. Sheila, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out for today.
Thank you so much to both of you. Mark, it's been such a pleasure and so valuable and timely to have your experience and thoughts about finding any peace whatsoever as fast as we can these days. And Lisa, thank you so much for your thoughtful moderation, for capturing questions from our audience. Always wonderful and engaged. And thank you so much for joining us. There is one more PON event on the 2024 calendar, which is the Kelman Seminar, open to the public. It will be on December 10th. The 2025 PON lineup is currently being finalized. It will include talks by faculty about their new books, talks by thoughtful practitioners, just like Mark, and just ways for us to try to push forward our understanding about how to improve negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution in today's troubled world. Executive education put on by PON is available both live and virtually, and those lineups will be posted soon. I know that Lisa and I are teaching in the masterclass live next week. I'm also doing a one-day on difficult conversations in December with my co-author, Doug Stone. You can visit the PON website for more information. We hope to see you soon, live or virtually. Be well and stay safe.